Latin America is perhaps the region with the least military ambition in the world. Their governments spend relatively little on defense, and in general, with some exceptions, creating large and powerful armies is not exactly a priority. Despite this, the subject of the armed forces has been very controversial in the region in recent years. And that's no wonder, because the second half of the 20th century wasn't exactly a quiet time for Latin America. Throughout this period, and especially in the 1960s and 1970s, this region was one of the territories in the world which was the most affected by military force.
Fuerzas Armadas son conscientes de la magnitud de la tarea a realizar.
For these years, practically every country in the region participated in what kind of became a macabre tradition of coups, military groups, and of course, plenty of repression. For example, let's take a look at 1978.
Por esta costa no abundan estas playas.
Para dar nacimiento al Perú actual.
In that year, among other countries, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, Cuba, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Panama, and even the peaceful Uruguay were under a military dictatorship. And do forgive me if I left any out, because, well, as you can see, it's a pretty long list. Dictators of every kind existed: left, right, pro-US, anti-US, harder, softer, but, well, they all had one common element, and that was repression. And yeah, in the framework of the Cold War and bloc struggles, many of these dictatorships, they were supported by the United States under the framework of what was later known as Operation Condor, a sinister intelligence collaboration plan forged between the military dictatorships of Videla's Argentina, Pinochet's Chile, Alfredo Stroessner's Paraguay, João Figueiredo's Brazil, and Bordaberry's Uruguay. They were all aided by the CIA in order to achieve a single objective: persecute and annihilate the political opposition, especially the leftist groups that were supported by the Soviet regime. And of course, as you might expect, the dictatorships forged under the other political color, they weren't any better, not at all in fact. Considering this, it isn't hard to imagine why the armed forces issue has been so controversial. Well, more than 30 years have now passed since this dark period, and in this video, we're going to be answering several questions. What is the current state of Latin America's armies? What functions do they really have? And do they pose any risk to the democracy and freedom of these countries? Well, let's dive in.
Armies in Latin America.
Before we begin, and just out of curiosity, well, let me ask you a question. Which do you think are the strongest, most powerful armies in Latin America? Well, this is always quite subjective, but according to the Global Firepower Index from 2017, which is an indicator that attempts to measure which armies are more powerful under different parameters, these are the top 5 in Latin America. First place, not really surprising, it goes to Brazil, which is the greatest regional power. This is followed by, in this order, Mexico, Argentina, Peru, and Colombia. The truth is that Latin America is the region with the smallest budget dedicated to defense. In 2016, it was just over 1% of its GDP, which is about $67 billion. This expenditure is much lower than the global average, especially because Latin American armies tend to have quite a high number of soldiers. To get an idea, in total the region has over 1.73 million soldiers. And of course, the combination of a low budget with many soldiers leads to outdated armies with plenty of operational problems. Let's take a look at the most important army, the Brazilian army. Brazil spends $23.7 billion every year, which kind of on the face of it seems like quite a lot, right? Well, the problem is that the army has 340,000 soldiers, which means that 3/4 of the budget goes to salaries and to pensions. If to this we add basic supplies, then the money left for equipment is very, very low. And in the rest of Latin America, ratios are similar. On average, 70% of the money goes directly to salaries. In other words, Latin American armies usually have a lot of soldiers and very little equipment.
Assumo o cargo de comandante.
Looking inwards.
So, if we talk about armies, wars, and conflicts between countries, we could say that Latin America is one of the most peaceful regions in the world. The last armed conflict occurred in 1995 in what was later known as the Cenepa War. This involved Ecuador and Peru, but no formal declaration of war was ever made. Since then, the trend has begun that has made Latin America a benchmark. Every time there is a conflict between two countries, instead of threatening each other with bombs and cannons, those involved resort to international justice. This is what is currently happening, for example, with the conflict between Bolivia and Chile over the seafront, a conflict that is being resolved at the International Court of Justice in The Hague.
Bolivia replies to the lawsuit against Chile at the Hague Court for sea access.
However, internally, well, they are completely different. We could say that Latin America has the record for being the most peaceful region and at the same time, the most violent one. What I mean here is that between countries there is no serious threat of war, but the situation is different if we talk about internal violence. More incredible than that, though, is the fact that 1 in 3 homicides that occur every year globally take place in Latin America. So, because apparently all enemies are at home, Latin American military forces focus on at-home tasks, such as confronting guerrillas, drug traffickers, or just dealing with violence in general. In fact, in the region, it is becoming increasingly common for military forces to replace the police in security and surveillance tasks. The problem here is that evidence shows that soldiers aren't really good at playing the role of the police.
The insufficient solution.
Contrary to what we might think at first, crime rates in Brazil or Mexico, far from decreasing, have increased since soldiers began participating in citizen security. In fact, the 5 most dangerous cities in the world, Caracas, Acapulco, San Pedro Sula, Central District, and Victoria, have a military presence. And, well, that's not all. Power abuse, extrajudicial detentions, or collateral victims have also increased with military presence, which further favors and feeds a culture of violence. This is something that is unfortunately far too widespread in the region nowadays. The thing is that soldiers are forces trained for war in order to eliminate the enemy, not to impose order and the rule of law. To achieve rule of law, what is needed are detectives, courts, judges, local police forces, and even citizen collaboration, not the military. We can take a look at what has happened, for example, in Mexico. As soon as he became president in December 2006, Felipe Calderón declared war on drugs and placed the army on the streets. Since then, not only has narcotics trafficking not decreased, but homicide rates have tripled. The army, it's simply not enough. They can, of course, lend a hand in very serious cases, but they cannot be a police force. It just doesn't work. And yes, I do know that corruption in the police is a problem, but this isn't simply fixed by resorting to using the army. And indeed, this actually leads to 2 other major problems. The first one is political risk. So consider this.
Latin America's armed forces must be anti-imperialist. Evo Morales.
Well, what do you want me to say? To me, seeing politicians use military forces to defend their political ideas, whatever they might be, seems very, very dangerous. Using that power of force is always going to be super tempting. This is what has happened, for example, in Venezuela, where the armed forces have pretty much become something like a Praetorian Guard for Nicolas Maduro's Bolivarian regime. And if that wasn't enough, there is also the big corruption problem. See, the military industry is really opaque, and it's got huge contracts, which are 2 pretty basic ingredients for corruption. Just have a look at what happened in 2010 in the Dominican Republic.
In 2010, a major corruption scandal affected the Dominican Armed Forces due to the fraudulent purchase of 8 Super Tucano aircraft from the Brazilian company Embraer. It is suspected that $87 million remained in the hands of members of the country's political and military hierarchy. Lilian Bobea, professor at Bentley University in Massachusetts.
And that's just one example, and it's not even the most important one. So taking all of this into account, maybe it would be a good idea to consider some sort of military alliance.
A Latin American NATO?
Now, allow me to propose an idea that may seem just a touch crazy. Now, based on what we've just discussed, wouldn't it be a good idea to think about building a great military alliance? An alliance in which different countries could organize and provide different units and bodies for different types of tasks. This would have several major advantages. For one, military influence over political power would decrease and sovereignty would be guaranteed for all countries. In addition, and if necessary, during natural disasters, Latin American countries could have an army that could deploy rapidly where they are needed. It could also push for much needed Latin American integration and to increase this region's role in the world of politics. But above all, it would free many resources, both economic and human, and this could be used to promote citizen security and reduce violence rates in these countries. In a way, the European Union, they're actually trying to do something similar, so while it may sound like a bit of a crazy idea at first, maybe it's not that crazy after all. For example, Costa Rica suppressed its army decades ago, and the results in terms of security have been better than those of its neighbors. We've said before here on VisualPolitik that the 21st century is going to be India's century, and probably China and Asia in general. But now we're wondering, maybe Latin America too? Well, now you've heard our opinion here at VisualPolitik, and now it's your turn. Do you agree that soldiers can be used to replace the police for matters of security? Well, do let us know in the comments section below. Also, please do like and subscribe for brand new videos every Monday and Thursday. Also, do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching.